All right. Good evening to everybody joining us for this evening's program. I'd like to welcome you to Virtual CAAM. I like to say when we do these virtual programs, while our public doors are closed, obviously due to COVID-19, our virtual experience is very much alive and well. And we're happy that you decided to spend some time with us this evening. We're well aware of the emotional and psychological stress that for many of us has been extremely present over the last few weeks. And of course, we at CAAM are deeply committed to and invested in Black life, creativity, and culture, and the Black experience 365 days of the year. And we hope that tonight provides a space of creativity, reprieve, and respite. I'd like to thank our programming partners at Art and Practice for working with us on tonight's program. This particular program is the first in an installation of 4-part series programs exploring documentation as an intentional and value-driven process, and looks at the importance of publishing and text-based offerings and efforts for artists. We're being joined tonight by a lovely and really highly qualified cast of Black women publishers, and writers and just really extremely brilliant people. This evening, we're joined by Deputy Director and Chief Curator Cameron Shaw, who will be our moderator for the evening, as well as CASSANDRA Press co-curator, Kandis Williams, Sming Sming Books and Objects imprint creator Vivian Sming, and founding editor of ARTS.BLACK Jessica Lynne. I'd like to open us up by welcoming each of them. Jessica Lynne is a writer and art critic. She is a founding editor of ARTS.BLACK, an online journal of art criticism from Black perspectives. Her writing has been featured in publications such as Art in America, The Believer, Bomb Magazine, The Nation, and elsewhere. She is currently at work on a collection of essays about love, faith, and the American South. That sounds like a dream. Can't wait to read that. Jessica lives and works in coastal Virginia. Vivian Sming is an artist, writer, and publisher. She uses text, images, videos, and other new genres to engage post-human discourse and is committed to fostering interdisciplinary dialogue through publications and programming. She is the senior editor at Daily Serving, published through California College of the Arts in San Francisco, and editor of Nonsensical, a journal of critical and experiment writing by visual artists. Sming publishes artist books and monographs through her imprint, Sming Sming Books and Objects. She holds a BA in art with a minor in anthropology from UCLA and an MFA from Cal Arts. She was a 2016-2017 fellow at the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts. Kandis Williams is an artist, writer, editor, and publisher. Williams received critical acclaim for her college art, performance art, and publishing works. Williams is represented by the Knight Gallery here in Los Angeles, where she works and lives. Her work often explores contemporary critical theory, including but not limited to racial nationalism, authority, and eroticism. In addition to Williams' studio, writing, and publishing practices, Williams is also a visiting faculty member at Cal Arts School of Art. In 2016, she co-founded Cassandra, a publishing project that runs with the artists Taylor Duran and Jordan Nasser, which provides a lo-fi activist and academic texts, flyers, posters, pamphlets, and Williams Readers series. Her ongoing collage practice seems to function as a catalyst and container for work in other mediums, such as choreography, performance, and pedagogy. She studied at the Cooper Union School of Art. And our moderator for the evening, who I previously mentioned, Cameron Shaw, is of course our Deputy Director and Chief Curator at CAAM, where she guides the curation departments as well as marketing and communications. Shaw was previously the co-founder and executive director of New Orleans-based Pelican Bomb, a nonprofit contemporary art organization that presented a forum for exhibitions, public program, and arts journalism. Her writing has widely been published in the New York Times, Art in America, and the New Orleans Times-Picayune, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and Bomb Magazine, as well as numerous books and exhibition catalogs. She was awarded the Creative Capital Award, the Andy Warhol Foundation of Arts Writers Grant for short form writing in 2009, and the Robert Rochberg Foundation Art in America Writing Fellowship in 2015. So I'd like to thank you all again for joining us and open us to the conversation with these lovely panelists and moderator.
Thanks, Alexandra. First of all, I want to thank all of our panelists for being here this evening and everyone tuning in. I know I'm alternating between states of grief, exhaustion, and feeling energized by the momentum of this moment. So wherever you are today, thank you for being here to share your time, your energy, your questions, and insights. Speaking of energy, it's very hard to read the room when you are the only person in that room, but we're gonna do our very best to let this conversation flow where it wants to go. I'll be providing questions. I encourage our panelists to ask questions of one another, and folks at home, you can add your questions to the Q&A box. I'll insert them when appropriate, and as we're nearing the end, we'll also make some additional room for your questions. As Alexandra stated, one of the original goals of this panel was to talk about documentation as an intentional and value-driven process and how that takes shape in publishing and text-based efforts for artists. When people talk about documentation in the art world, they're often talking about photographing an artwork or installation or creating an exhibition catalog that's chief function is to reproduce these photographs. Our panelists all have very different definitions of documentation that extend far beyond that. So I wanted to first start with each of you introducing yourself and a little bit about your practice briefly before we dive into some questions and more conversation. Jess, would you like to start?
Sure. Let me take myself off of mute first. I'm going to share my screen and not only show you all a visual of the ARTS.BLACK website, but kind of name a couple of questions and guiding frameworks that inform what I am up to. So let me do that now. Okay. Okay. Okay, great. So I won't be going through all of the slides, but I think the first three are really important to who I am and how I move in the world these days. As Alexandra mentioned, I am a writer and critic, and my editorial baby of the past 5 years has been ARTS.BLACK, an online journal of art criticism that publishes Black writers. I come to this work alongside my co-editor and co-founder, Taylor Aldridge, and it really is our mission to cultivate, support, and ultimately create an ongoing record of Black writers who are responding to cultural production and as vast an understanding of that definition as we can allow. I certainly, in the context of this conversation, understand ARTS.BLACK through the lens of continuums of Black textual production. Though we don't have a physical imprint and are only online, I think the spirit of Black literary journals and presses, some of which I will refer to, I'm sure, in this conversation, that spirit is deeply embedded and woven in the work that we do as a journal. And it is always our mission to kind of prioritize Black scholarship in that way. So I want to ask this question aloud because I think it both informs my kind of editor's hat as well as the hat that I wear as an individual writer and critic. How might we understand sites of critique as interventions? ARTS.BLACK emerges 5 years ago, 6 years actually in December, as I think so many journals, museums, other types of arts organizations were trying to think about this word that I really hate, diversity and inclusion. And I think for myself and Taylor, as two Black women working in the arts and making our way in this field, we wanted to be insistent and ensure that the ecology of criticism was not left out of how folks began to talk about equity. And so for us, when we think about criticism, we understand it as responses in real time, certainly, but we also understand it as really intervening in discourse that can erase or flatten how we are understanding visual culture around us. I will also say that ARTS.BLACK doesn't necessarily have a mandate to only write about the work of artists of African descent. although I think it is important that many of our writers who are interested in kind of finding a home with us feel that that is a personal mission of theirs. And we know that there are a myriad of reasons as to why that is important. It is a personal mission of mine, but sometimes I think that there can be the misunderstanding that we are kind of saying our writers can only write about quote unquote Black things. And I want to acknowledge that certainly that is a priority, but the mission for us is Black scholarship engaging with the world around us, as complicated and messy as it is. And so critique becomes that intervening mode. Okay, and I also kind of wanted to propose a relationship between intimacy and criticism that is both political and aesthetic, that it can move us closer to planes of formal experimentation, as in how does your criticism show up on the page, while also allowing for a sustained close reading of a body of work as it unfolds over time. And I think certainly this is something that I cling to as in my own practice as a writer. There's, I think there are mixed feelings about the way intimacy and closeness can live inside of the practice of a critic. Does it mean that you actually don't see things? Does it mean that there are kind of conflicts of interest that arise? And I actually am really working through a refusal of that. That intimacy allows for a particular type of view and a particular mode of seeing that is quite necessary to thoughtful, rigorous engagement. I have had so many conversations with artists, artists of color in particular, who feel as though a contemporary landscape of criticism misses a lot of things when it comes to their work. And I want to propose that intimacy can live alongside nuance in a way that is actually really generative and productive when thinking about the role of a critic in today's context. So with that, I'm just going to show you all the website because it is, I think, really beautiful. Thank you, Yasmin Vera, for keeping us in great shape. If you've been reading ARTS.BLACK for a while, you will notice that we've gone through 3 kind of aesthetic changes, and I think some of that is just what happens when you want to switch things up. We're also trying really hard to think about accessibility on our website, and that's something that we don't quite have right yet, but it is top of mind for us in terms of image captions, making sure that folks who are experiencing different levels of vision impairment can kind of engage with what's happening. So that is also a thing that I'm thinking about too. But for now, we're looking at the home screen, and if you scroll down, you'll see kind of a hover slider of some of our most recent pieces that we've published, including an essay and a review by Stephanie Jason on Josie Kanu's recent exhibition at the Studio Museum. The homepage is divided into the categories that we publish: essays, interviews, and reviews. And I think that I will stop there and look forward to the ongoing dialogue. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you, Jess. It's really important to just take that moment to orient with exactly what y'all do. Vivian, would love to hear from you.
Sure, thanks. Let me share my screen. So first of all, thank you so much, Cameron and Alexandra, for all the work in organizing this conversation. I know we were supposed to be in person, and I wish we could be in person. But I'm, just really excited to be in, in conversation with Candice and Jessica, who both whose practices I really admire. So thank you for having me. So I started Sming Sming Books 3 years ago, and since then I've published over 20 books. And typically how I work with artists is I work one-on-one and collaboratively with each artist to create books that really use the ideas, artist ideas and intentions to then arrive at the book's form. So everything looks a little bit different. So when I think about this question of archive and documentation, I'm really interested in how the book itself can be the work, or how it can sit alongside or next to the work in not like a straightforward representation of it, but to be in like dialogue with it. And I sort of fell into publishing by accident. So I didn't, intend to arrive here, but there were all these questions that I had been mulling over for many years that have really led me here. So, some of these questions are about accessibility, interdisciplinarity, cultural equity, discourse, supporting artists without accumulating wealth, and the taking up of very little space. So these are just some guiding questions that, I'm really interested in hearing you all talk about later as well. And so in the interest of time, I'm just gonna gloss over a whole bunch of projects, but I do wanna just preface by saying that each book, there's so much thought and work put into them. So I'm definitely not gonna do them justice, but it's just to give you an idea of like the different forms that these books can take. So this is Sabley Smith's Landscapes and Playgrounds, which looks at familial relationships and how they're formed through or reconciled through the surveillance and the structure of the carceral system. So thinking about the prison yard in relationship to the schoolyard architecturally. And the book includes personal and found images, letters from Sabley's father, as well as her own writing. And this is printed in a way that feels very, childlike and colorful, but first with this subject matter. And then this is Michel Dizon and Viet Le's White Gaze, which uses the existing pages from National Geographic's from the 30s onwards. And Michel has basically redacted text to then reveal the colonialist lens and project that is National Geographic. Thinking about, who gets to make images of the world, and how, in particularly those of us from refugee or immigrant families come to understand ourselves through this lens. And this work is paired with Viet's poetry, which provide these moments of pause as well as additional historical context. And then this last one I'll present is Kenyatta A.C. Hinkle's Contifrications, Convergent Truths and Realities, which is part of a larger living project around the contested continent and geography of Contifrica. So in the naming of Contifrica as a place, Kenyatta really questions, who gets to make geographical claims and what fictions become nonfictions and what nonfictions become fictions. And the project really invites everyone to collaboratively and collectively build the history, the rituals, and culture of Contifrica in order to examine how history and knowledge is created and upheld. And so I thought I'd just end with this quote from Michel Dizon, which is this term called Archival Futurism. And she calls it a realm of intimacy between the dead, the living, and the still to be born, part of a larger project of liberation and an anti-colonial claim to the past from the future. So I really like thinking about books as like something that is designed to be read and looked at by someone in the future, and how they sort of can transcend time, even though they can be a documentation of the past, the present, or speculation of the future. But upon the very creation and manifestation of a book, it ultimately immediately becomes something of the past that then gets circulated and acquired as an archive for the future. And I think of books as well as this very ancient and successful piece of technology that has this ability to bend time. And I think for artists, that really means it's a rich form to work with that can, really offer sites as possible sites as of intervention to directly contest the production of knowledge.
Thank you so much, Vivian. Candice, would love to have an introduction from you to your work.
Hello. I'm probably the most spirally of the introductions. I'll share a screen. I really appreciated both of those intros, though. So I run CASSANDRA Press, and a small amendment, I guess, to my bio is that I run CASSANDRA Press now with Amelia and Koshiro from Sisters with Invoices, and I no longer run the press with Jordan Nasser. And we work with Taylor Dorn to curate the artist scene section of the press, and I primarily curate the community section, and I make the readers and disseminate everything. So just a small bio fix. That was an old bio. So yeah, Cassandra as a press has pretty much focused on lo-fi printed matter, distributing things that are like, for me as an artist, like I'm an artist and I come out of a collage background, so the texture of Xerox has always been something that's very felt and immediate. So it's sort of like a response also to seeing a very like large virtual audience, you know, positing ideological and philosophical questions that were very exciting in 2016 when we founded. And sort of like trying to like, you know, imagine a way of touching that sort of language or that dialogue or that conversation. And I think similarly to others in this talk, figuring out a way to leave a trace, to make a claim. So to sort of like collectively witness, I think that's a term that I'm really interested in this press, like how we can look at and hold historical trauma through printed matter, but also through dialogue, through the dialogic, through having things be constantly in almost a collage form of questioning rhetorical balance between the image and conversations that image starts and where image lands and how image is stored or archived or located. So Cassandra is a really, Cassandra is like a question of archive and access press, I guess. With the readers especially, I'm curating it from a Black femme position, so and Western Black femme position, I should say, an American Black femme position. And so the curation of the readers is all sort of like very pressing, experiential, and existential questions for me. And that's how I sort of curate, is through, I think I've said it before, I curate through anxiety, like a lot of the text, because the text as academic texts also sort of produce that similar sort of anxiety around exclusion. And so it's for me like a kind of calling in of resources to make these monster textbooks almost of different source material. And again, I think similar to Jessica, linking people who like live and embody and enable and enact and activate certain kinds of methodologies of resistance, and seeing those very much discursively removed in academia and discourse was a real motivator for starting the press. And yeah, and I think as we expand, it seems like we're invested in this sort of like first person collage brain as an answer, I think, to colonialist expansion and logics of evisceration. So the claim of the printed material almost as a space where we can double a sort of bodily claim of investment in institutions, investment in just line of sight, in being legible, in being visible, together in trauma and in you know, places of generation or generativity or something. Generativity, probably not a word. Yeah, and that's Cassandra. I can show you guys the website a little bit as well. Bring up the website. Actually, no, I talked enough. That's enough.
Thank you, Candice.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd like to hear from each of you right now how you're conceiving yourself as publishers in this moment, and particularly the ways in which your understanding of yourselves as publishers, or what the work is that you're documenting, how that's shifted in the recent weeks and months. Jess, would you like to start?
Sure, absolutely. The other day, Cameron, you asked a really, I think, poignant question during our test run check-in about the relationship between the archive and the digital. And as I thought about that, I kept coming back to this, to the point that it's okay to be honest about the precarity of the digital. ARTS.BLACK very much is situated in the context of kind of an art world setting and the reality of media culture. And so in the past, I'll just say 2 years, for example, we've seen many digital sites close, shutter. Billionaires are upset and exploiting labor. And what that has resulted in is the absence of kind of perhaps presumed infiniteness around what could be available and accessed and returned to online. And I think that that's an important point to acknowledge, because to me, as someone who is publishing writers and takes very seriously the way in which ARTS.BLACK has become a record of Black writers across the Black diaspora, I'm also not a computer scientist or whiz. And there are a lot of things that I don't know about how to best archive what is happening through ARTS.BLACK online, right? And I think internet culture and the politics of media right now is something that's on my mind. Having said that, I think it is a responsibility that I take on to think about the other ways the mission of ARTS.BLACK can be concretized, right? And I think Candice and Vivian represent two really beautiful examples of the way in which that rigor can translate itself offline. And so, you know, I acknowledge that, at least personally, sometimes there is an allure to think about the IRL and the URL as these two entities in which there's a wide gap that we must traverse. But the reality is that's not true, right? That like we are in the world and the internet is in the world with us. And so many of us are trying to make worlds around that, if you will. But I do think it is important for me as a publisher to be kind of attending to the question of form and presentation, right? And so in a context of the now, the contemporaneous, which is a context of political uprising, like what can ARTS.BLACK do in a physical setting? Like how can we concretize the real scholarship and thought that is being published and shared via our online portal, right? Like how can that take another form in this 3D landscape? And I hope that I imagine, I'm confident that we'll get to some answers, but that question is certainly top of mind for me, right? That things can disappear, and if things disappear, what is left of them, what can be left of them, and how can we be proactive in ensuring that there is some sort of physical reminder that the work that these writers have been doing, the artists that they're responding to and find themselves in conversation with, that is not something that will disappear should the internet blow up tomorrow, which I don't think it will. But you know, I think that the impulse to be thinking about that in the context of media culture is really important for me right now.
There's two things that I want to come back to there later on in the conversation. One is the potential of the digital, which I want to talk to you about in specific because you are working in that form. And the other is actually form, because I think you guys are all using really interesting specificities of form. So we'll come back to those things a little bit later. Candice, I know there's been some really monumental change actually in the way that you think about the press in the last 6 months. So I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about that change, but also then where that's been pushed even further by the events of the last several months, and especially the last few weeks, how you're showing up with the work and how the work's changing for you.
For sure, yeah, it's such a big conversation. I feel like I'm just hearing bits of Vivian and Jess, and just also feeling, you know, the geist of it all right now. You know, I feel like that is something that I feel really positive about, is just, you know, this moment of kind of cracking open again, you know, like another kind of opening moment, and seeing, you know, people who've been doing 4 years of work since I feel like the last rash of state-sanctioned murders we saw go viral, right? Like the people who've been working in the last 4 years to kind of collect I mean, really intense ideological and material resources, and very intense ethical resources, and very intense aesthetic resources, and you know, intense political resources, and like yeah, and that's the thing that is really nice to have language for that. Thank you guys for, because that's the thing, the only thing that's exciting. I keep getting people being like, aren't you inspired? And like, no, I'm not. You know, the only thing I'm inspired by actually is the shaking of some, you know, like this shaking has produced, you know, yeah, more through lines of communication with people who are doing very similar things, and beautifully, you know, doing similar things, especially from like pro-Black standpoints. I mean, something I just wrote about today, and I think something that's been really changing in the press in the last couple of months, is just thinking about anti-Blackness and racism is almost like ships that pass in the night, right, and are misidentified. Like that so many different anti-racist platforms use anti-Black strategies to communicate awareness of race. Like in January, I did a show at Printed Matter, solo show, for like a first solo show. So on top of sort of like, this is a big share, sorry, but on top of sort of like, you know, the actual labor dissemination in the press and how that worked, you know, like the urgency for me has been there since 2016. So the Reader series has taken over a large part of the presence of the press. And for my other, you know, my initial partners, it was not, that racial dynamic wasn't there. So I think that urgency also wasn't there. And so then it didn't expand in certain, our Hydra head approach, for instance, you know, like I became one big wobbly head. But yeah, so I think the big makeover, like the kind of internal makeover that Cassandra got, is really sort of looking at investing across platforms. I was curating a show before COVID called Boomerang, that I was thinking about exactly like how Cassandra has galvanized energy around certain topics or contents or themes, and as a symposium building and call to action, to like kind of like you know, throw around and see where its farthest reaches, and kind of like collect you know, material coming back. And that material is like the connections to people doing similar work. So having Amelia from Sisters with Invoices be a big part of the press right now in terms of just operations has been like a real makeover and revelation, and you know, has opened up, I think, the press to a community that I've been discursively thinking about, and really sort of predicating a lot of my energy on discursively positioning for myself. That's my curation, you know. And now I feel like the last 4 months have been calls to action. So I feel like yeah, that's how the sort of the and it's something I'm writing about now too, right? Like how archives and museums sort of like along this logic of evisceration, right? Because genocide isn't like incidental, it's a logic. It produces all these banal instances of itself. And so sort of like, yeah, just how can we sort of make material dams to those banal incidences? Where is the poetic and ethical space that, like, you know, shields us from the logics of evisceration, and how do those logics get co-opted by other, you know, capitalist money-making systems that put money first? I think COVID gave us a lot of language for that. That was really personally inspiring for me to not normalize a lot of like anti-ethical practices that I see in the art world and in publishing and in my personal, you know, interactions with other artists and with institutions. So I'm just like, I think continuing through this uprising, and I'm really also grateful to have, you know, shared language around that. It is an uprising, and to have language around, you know, to talk to people who like who I don't need to translate to, but then to know that I have a lot to translate. You know, they're like kind of simultaneous currents that I think are taking the press in really fun, or not fun, but really important directions. Like we're starting a school, so this idea of being online and being a part of a diasporic conversation via the virtual, and the power of sort of like Blackness as a virtual mechanism for understanding autonomy and resistance, like that we've already been sort of like symbol made and symbol making, and so and therefore like sort of virtue as a signal, right, like is a Black technology or something. So I've been thinking about all those ways that, you know, Blackness communicates, hyper communicates, that it organizes decentrally. And so taking the press into a direction where it's like a lot of decentralized project building feels like the energy that's very exciting right now. And decentralized conversations, you know, like conversations that also don't center well, decentral, let's just say that. Yeah, so this kind of like makeover with Cassandra has been kind of like from the ground up, and it's really nice to sort of stabilize a set of values and a kind of logic for the press to proceed from, and not, yeah, I'm not super tied to the page anymore, you know, and that's a really nice feeling. Like, I feel like I've read for 4 years, and now it's time to sort of like call people to action around these limits, like sites of limited knowledge, or limited sites of knowledge, like what Jess was saying about intimacy and how you see what you see. So yeah, the last 3 readers that we made were on primitivism, two-dimensional design, the Chitlin circuit, and blackface, minstrelsy, and cannibalism. So between those 3 readers, I'm covered till the end of 2020, I hope. Yeah.
That you bring up of value is really someplace that I wanted to go next. So Vivian, as you sort of answer the question of how things are shifting for you, I'm hoping that you can also bring to the fore what is the core value that's driving the work. And I'd love to come back to Jess and Candice also to hear from you really specifically where the core value is around the work. But Vivian, let's hear a little bit from you.
Yeah, I mean, I really relate to Candice, you know, the sentiment of like curating through anxiety is just something that I'm still anxious, and I still need to like, there's this like anxious production, and that hasn't, I don't think that has left. I think, you know, I mean, you know, if I can speak for us as makers, you know, I think we're doing what we're doing because change isn't happening fast enough, and it's like these, you know, very material actions that that we're hoping will maybe stick. So yeah, I'm just thinking, I think through a lot about taking sort of a maximalist, you know, just like approach in terms of thinking through, you know, just as you called, like this diversity and inclusion project in order to like move beyond tokenization. You know, the core of what my project is really about, like, you know, I like thinking about the biodiversity of like a healthy tropical forest, and just how there's like all these different microclimates and different, you know, all these different, you know, tree frogs, for instance, and maybe there's like 10 different kinds of tree frogs, and to have that, all of those be represented in order to break through the homogeny. And I think we're getting some of that now, where it's like, actually, every one of us has a different position, a different opinion, and we're not going to all agree. And that is okay. And I think we need to be like recognized for that, those differences, and for those, you know, individualities. So I'm hoping to do that with books in terms of just, you know, I mean, I haven't gotten there yet, but I just want to see as many different kinds of perspectives as physically possible, and like that take on all these different forms. Yeah.
Multitudinousness as a value.
Yeah.
Jess, is there something that you want to explicitly state as a value that's coming forward or has been at the core of the practice?
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly thinking a lot about the complexity of Black thought and what it means to revel in that, to take it for granted, not in relation or opposition to whiteness, but as something that can be desirable and pleasurable unto itself. I know that that's not one word, but there's, you know, as I situate ARTS.BLACK in kind of in a relationship to other publishers who have done this before us, I'm thinking a lot about folks like Dudley Randall of Broadside Press, for example, in Detroit. I'm thinking a lot about the Nardal sisters of Martinique and La Revue du Monde Noir, right? And how in each instance, there was a way in which they knew that they had something to say to a wider world, but they also knew that they had something to say to Black people across geopolitical boundaries and cultural contexts, right? Like I'm thinking of Kitchen Table Press from the 80s and what it meant for those women, particularly Black lesbian women and other women of color, to kind of stake a position and claim, and how their roles as witnesses. I love that Candice might certainly continue to intervene, but it's also a conversation that only they, in certain instances, a conversation that they only could make legible to themselves. And there's something about that that's really important to me. Like, as I think about the exhaustion of this moment, I don't always want to have to explain myself to whiteness. And so I am wondering always like what it means to be able to kind of, for Black folks to be unto themselves in a way. That's a long answer to your question, but you know.
No, literally my next question was, who are you looking to in the past? So you're on it, you're all over it. Candice, as you think about value, who are some of the sources that you're looking to in the past, either people or entities, presses, whatever it may be? What's coming forward for you?
Oof, values of the past. I think one thing that I'm thinking kind of along the lines of what Jess was saying is that okay, so I can rattle off like all of my favorite Black scholars, right? And like a couple Black artists, but I think these ideas, like what I'm really stuck on is like, how can we create new models to produce different logics to how we're disseminated? Like even the idea of being auctioned, sold, cataloged, all these nomenclatures that come out of like colonial expansion. And how can we sort of like produce from this moment of like witnessing, right? Where like if there's an audience right now of white people who need something explained, maybe we can explain the logic that produces this constant genocidal procedural instruction in white bodies, you know, to dismantle and destroy otherness, you know, like, so I don't know. I think a logic like anti-genocide is something like I don't know if that's one word either, but there's a thing that kind of is emerging right now for me where it's like control of the narrative feels very important. So thinking about what is Black culture, I know it's like a Spiller's idea, it's a Moten idea, Stuart Hall, you know, like all these that we've been so preoccupied with, like as Jess is saying, proving ourselves, you know, and I don't even say preoccupied. I mean, you know, intently invested and like hyper invested, over invested in the representation of Blackness, and that ends up getting channeled into like very racist commercial imaging or through racist commercial industries, or that it gets sequestered behind paywalls, behind institutional paywalls, museum paywalls, and really separated from the culture that produces it. I think this provides this constant source of schizophrenia for the Black cultural producer, period. You know, like whether it's a person making a video about their dinner, you know, or a person being beaten to death by a cop, you know, like Blackness provides this kind of like extremity of modernity, like the most extreme production of modern modernity is the space that officially is Black. But I'm really invested in like, I guess, systems of repair, recuperation that can like counter that logic, really sustainably counter that logic. Like, why are we so okay with these archives of pictures of slaves and not names? You know what I mean? Like those things. Like, why are we okay with sort of like, you know, archives like the African American newspaper of Baltimore not having a home, you know, as not having a home as stable as the Smithsonian? You know, why are we okay with Getty Images owning, you know, Ebony and Jet's archives, and you know, not really having a system that's immediate in place for the dissemination of those archives to Black filmmakers, Black sex workers, Black TikTokers? You know what I mean? Like this is like kind of the thing that I'm thinking about now, is like this how our images are held and withheld, and then produce like this figure, this Black figure, this technology of dealing with state-sanctioned violence for everyone, right? Like blackface is global. So I'm thinking about how to sort of like produce logics that counter that. And so I guess rationality is a value, but like real rationality, you know, like not rationality that comes out of colonialist evisceration logic, but like, you know, the rationality of ownership, you know, like so that indigenous land claims can be heard, the rationality of rape and genocidal like legacies of our intimate space, right? So that like people who don't have legitimate gendered or familial sort of like whatever, I don't mean familial, like nuclear family claims to personhood have a permanent platform in humanity. Like there's, yeah. So I'm thinking, I guess, in that way. I'm a pattern seeker, so it works. But yeah, I think it's multi-level. You know, like I'm also equally as interested in my small lifetime, putting myself in more positive situations with Black producers, like Black cultural producers, like putting myself not antagonistically against whiteness, but in a logic also where I'm producing space that protects Black life and Black image, where I'm producing space that is antagonizing primitivist logic, where I'm producing space and programs, hopefully, or initiatives or pedagogical space of training, you know, like untraining or retraining perception, via these, you know, Sylvia Wynter, Fred Moten, Socia Hartman. I mean, those are all the set of all stars, but there's Donald Bogle is like if anybody knows Donald Bogle, please tell him, slide in my DMs anytime. I just would die. Like somebody who's actually in Black images, you know what I mean? Like the volumes, this person wrote the Bible on Black images and like how they function commercially, you know, like, so there's a lot of scholars. There's a lot of new scholars too. Mandy Williams, who's running the Women's Center for Creative Work in LA, Ideal Black Female on Instagram. A lot of, you know, Hannah Black is, I think the Tear Gas Biennial is like definitely ringing very, very, very much loudly in my ears right now. Mahfouz Sultan and Chloe Sultan, who are like their own archive in themselves, you know, bookmakers and soon to be publishers. So like, yeah, it's just, I'm deeply like, I'm just feel like this value, the value of internal logic, like a rationalization that protects Black life. Feels like it's going to be generative for everyone, you know, like that's like
something that I wanted to delve into more deeply is also where this intersects with the idea of circulation and what is in circulation, right? Publishing is so deeply tied to ideas of circulation. What made the advent of the printing press so revolutionary was that it allowed ideas, especially challenging ideas, to circulate in the public, introducing the era of mass communication. Digital publishing, of course, has pushed the possibility even further. But when we talk about circulation, like you pointed out, we're also talking about ownership, whether that be actual currency, who makes money selling a book or an image, to intellectual currency, access to ideas, and of course, social control. So I'd like to hear a little bit more how each of you is approaching this idea of ownership and how that's functioning in your practices right now. Yeah.
I'll just jump in here with the idea of ownership with the book that I had presented, White Gaze. We, you know, originally the artists were, you know, thinking through who gets to, you know, make images of the world. But by, you know, publishing and entering the book into circulation, we were contacted by Nat Geo's sales department, who, you know, inquired about licensing fees. And, you know, the book came out at the same time as their race issue, where they publicly admitted to their racist past as a past. But in thinking about what, you know, what Candice is bringing up in terms of just like undoing the logic, it's very tied in terms of, you know, this idea of circulation and ownership, where, you know, suddenly we had to think about copyright issues and like who gets to own images of the world and who gets to profit from those images and who the, you know, who's getting paid even, who, you know. And so I think those are the very material things, the very material economic structures of that publishing does navigate. So that's just, you know, one example of, you know, these ideas around ownership of images.
Jess, was there anything that you wanted to add?
Yeah, you know, I mean, I appreciate the point and the question, and I'm kind of like in two places. So as a digital journal, legally Taylor and I own the thing, right? However, because we aren't selling a product, we are very much dependent on philanthropic sources for funding. And I think this question of ownership in the context of what we do is actually really important, because there have been different moments in which we've had to think through what it means to be engaged in a philanthropic partnership with funders, right? And the extent to which, whether it is explicitly communicated or not, the extent to which philanthropy's ethos informs or could inform decisions that we make or don't make, right? And it's always important for me to talk about the kind of economic reality of ARTS.BLACK, because I think that in not doing so, it's a very, it just ignores so much about value, currency, and market as it relates to media culture. And so that question of ownership is really, for me, also connected to the relationship that philanthropy has with the arts. And now, as media is really kind of exploding, what are the other models that might manifest themselves in order to facilitate a process in which righteous work can be removed from the hands of philanthropy, right? Like, and maybe this is something I will get in trouble for, but I do think that's an important kind of note. That many of us have been dependent on arms of funding people who we perhaps are not necessarily the most immediately politically aligned with. And like, what does that mean? Like, it is an actual glitch, and it is something that has to be continually reckoned with. So that's one thing. At the same time, there's, right now, there's no one telling us every day, like, this is what you have to publish, this is what you have to do. So in that spirit, we are in a very fortunate and blessed position, right? And so when I think about what the mission is and what my personal mission is, I'm also thinking about the way Barbara Smith described the origins of Kitchen Table Press, right? As a way to control a significant means of communication, as a way to shape ideology into a foundation for practical social and political change. And so that kind of heart, that pulse, is also living alongside a capitalist context. And like, what do we do with that? I think that it's a question that I'm asking myself. And are there ways to undo, unlearn, rethink value, currency, so that the work that we do can be fully embodied and not tied explicitly or implicitly to these other structures that are permeating so much of all of the worlds that we move in. And maybe, like, for me, that is very connected to this uprising that we're seeing right now. Like, literally everything's on fire, including media. And maybe that's okay. Like, there has to be a way of, like, could there be a way of undoing what has entrenched so much of the quiet structures around us, violent structures around us? And how can we then, in the context of something that's being destroyed, rebuild something that's really kind of radical and restorative? So maybe this is also connected to the way in which, Candice, you've talked about logics, the logics of ownership, perhaps.
Candice, I want to introduce a question to you that came from our audience, which is directly tied to this, which is that this comes from Jeff. Cassandra reminds me a lot of work done by a site like arg.org, but hyper-organized in a super interesting, synthesized, and personal way that is really special. Given what happened to ARG, and Sean personally, I don't know if you're familiar with this narrative, I'm personally not, how would you manage the real personal risk one takes when working toward open access of information in the face of capitalist systems that are constantly trying to regulate that flow of information?
Well, this ties in nicely, I guess, because I think, there's a lot. All right, so One thing I think related back to Jess is that I don't think we have to destroy or rebuild. I feel like we are so many technologies, like the Blackness in the plantation, the enclosure culture, the movement of like the surveillance capitalism born on the plantation, the subsequent kind of like movement and migration that actively uses call and response to organize across so many different fields, like resistance across so many different fields. I think this issue of ownership and who owns the image of Blackness, who owns intellectual property, who owns copyrights of, say, you know, the things that are on fire right now, right? Nancy Pelosi and kente cloth, this idea of like weird boxer braids. Like, this is what I mean by this kind of like this, even people being aware, making claims, visual claims to be aware of racism, use anti-Black tropes to do so, you know? So it's like, I think it's this thing of not having to rebuild. I think we are so much of culture. We are so much of this. Me and Amelia joke that we're the ethical supremacists. You know, like Blackness is this place of persistent, constant ethics in motion. You know, like the get up, the get down, the fall, the keep moving. You know, the paralysis, the everything. And I just really deeply feel that there is so much of lines of sight are missing. You know, that this logic of evisceration has produced so much erasure in terms of the actual project or the life, you know, of Blackness. Like, we get these very the images that the archive releases to us, right, that we banner around Black history, are phenomenal. You know, they're singular. Like, they don't reinforce they don't enforce life, like the value of just life. They enforce only the value of Black political life. And I think just immediately sort of like, you know, advancing on these archives that are these places, you know, that either Black archives that have fallen, you know, defunct because they don't activate a white libidinal economy enough to be thought of as fascinating, you know, there aren't enough nude bodies, there aren't enough dead bodies in them, whatever, so they haven't been preserved. And making sure that, like, you know, photographic and film-based organizations, institutions, just immediately sort of transfer wealth in that way, endow archives that are not interesting, you know what I mean? Endow these archives that are not us dying in the streets, so that we have access to them, so that they're stable, you know. Like, I think that's a way that the logic can sort of like not fall on the individual archive producer to keep sort of asking for a logic, like a charity that also is not charity, right? It's like, it's the production of space for your evisceration, you know, like for your constant evisceration and the production of like a stable source of, I'm spiraling, sorry. Okay. Cassandra, in that answer also to ARG, is that it is specific because it's me, you know, like it's specific because my experience with racism, with sexism, with classism, with being a gendered body, with being a deviant body, a criminalized body, is how I curate all the texts. They're the texts that I like look to for renewed feeling. And so I think my identity as an artist, I think is, and how Cassandra doubles with that, is where I feel protected. All of them are, every reader is in an individual artwork for me. So I'm disseminating essentially editions, and, you know, come for me. JSTOR. That's what I say. And hopefully, you know, that I am, you know, an institutionally kind of complicit music, like artist will protect that point of view, you know, and hopefully that's a model that I can extend to others also.
Vivian, you also mentioned to me an interest in talking about the risks publishers take. How are you conceiving of what some of those risks are from the perspective of Sming Sming?
Yeah, I mean, I'm also just myself, and I'm not a LLC. I'm just, you know, accept all responsibility. And so you know, it really is about those one-on-one relationships that you're forming with, at least for me, with the artists, and just like how do I want to work? You know, what kind of relationship do I want to have, and how do we work through that collaboratively? And so it's a way to experiment with that. But yeah, I think there's, you know, just speaking to being responsible, you know, being the person responsible, not creating another entity that's gonna can dissolve and, you know, can, you know, not be accountable. So yeah, those are just some of the things thinking through.
Jess, is risk something that plays a role in the way that you think about the work of ARTS.BLACK?
Risk. Yeah, I mean, I think it's always a risk for us to be able to, one, allow writers to say what they want to say, I think on like a very kind of basic level. In a world that's not always interested in hearing from Black writers, in the context of an art world that loves Blackness as a commodity, right? Like I think that ARTS.BLACK is refusing that, right? And I also think we are trying to be really thoughtful about evolution and futurity, and in relationship to precarity, like somehow that always feels like a risk. I want to come back to this point of form, because so much of what might come or is coming from ARTS.BLACK might also take on form in a new way, and that feels like something worth risking, right? So all of those planes and kind of junctures for me are types of risk.
Yeah, form was actually something I really wanted to talk with you all about, because you use form in its specificities in really beautiful ways. Jess, I always come back to the way you and your practice have used letter writing as a form, the open letter between colleagues and peers and friends and mentors as a form of thinking through challenging ideas and really looking for the space of nuance. Candice, just the reader as form. It is such a specific form with such a history, and the way in which you work with that form and subvert it. And then Vivian, I was really thinking about the ways in which the book has moved beyond traditional formats in your practice into various forms of objects. So I'd love if we could if you guys would just give a second to kind of talk about how you're thinking about form and maybe form and in the context of futurity, because I think there's a really clear connection for me between the forms that we can imagine and the futures that we can imagine, or the forms that we call on to imagine the futures we want to be living in.
Yeah,
anyone who wants to take that on.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
It's you can go ahead.
Oh, I guess I really think about this idea of history as being something that's on paper. It's something that I personally reject, and thinking about the many spoken languages that are disappearing, and the ways of, as a result of languages disappearing, the ways that we're thinking is also disappearing. That's just like foreclosing on those possibilities. So even though, I've been working with paper and, I always think about this, this song lyric from Emily Haynes. It's like, our life isn't insane. Our life isn't insane, our life is insane, our life is insane, but it isn't insane on paper. And just like thinking about how, a moment like the one we're in now, where it just, the way that we're feeling and embodying this moment is almost, is almost beyond us. But once it gets recorded or written down, there's something about it becoming, if we read, history textbooks or whatever, there's a lot of things that have happened, and it like becomes normalized in a way, and comprehensible. So even though I'm working with the book form, I'm still thinking through how practices that are like sound-based, or performance-based, or other work, sculptural work, how that is more embodied, how can that be still documented and still, a record of it still held since this is the, understanding that we're working with is, history being on paper. Yeah, I'm not sure if I answered your question, but got a little confused.
This is something I wanted to talk about with you all as well, because Candice, this idea of what's on paper, that the West defines history by what is on paper, was something that also came up in our conversation. So I'd love to hear a little bit more from you about how you're thinking about your approach to tie back to this conversation around form in the reader, whether that's related to this idea of history and paper, or whether you're pushing back against that idea in other ways that you'd like to share.
I think, yeah, for sure. The reader form, so I'll just talk a little bit about the reader form and my work. Like, I think being a Black femme artist, I guess the whole, the going through art school and having to constantly, evidence a knowledge of theory or a knowledge of kind of like cultural producers that I didn't feel any connection to, or that I wasn't aligned with inherently. I think produced a lot of this, like, just sort of like the will to assemble, like almost like a collection of catch-up texts, and that's been a practice since I was in since I was in college. And then it kind of became performative in Berlin when I lived in Berlin because of a language gap. So being able to sort of like find texts and give text to friends who weren't English speakers, or, also, sort of receive text. I read a lot of Wittgenstein and I met Adrian Piper's writing in Germany. So just sort of getting stuff and being able to talk through text as a shared side of history, I guess, was like a really big thing, and with the reader form for me. And then definitely coming back to the States, like, and sort of realizing how, limited and lacking most, like, the standard education was around a lot of our cultural, like so much cultural energy and scholarly energy, just isn't disseminated. And so I think coming back to the States and being in the 2016 police brutality conversations, just sort of like, just the reader just felt like a proper, it felt like a way to be in public. Like, it felt like a way to share, to have a document that held shared, like, language that was shareable or something. And then, but I'm not super attached to the form anymore. It's so funny. Like, I think with COVID and with like this moment right now, formlessness has been like really on my mind, like decentralization, formlessness, like the idea of like I think hearing language like tear it down, rebuild, I'm asking myself, what are the materials that we're tearing down? What are the ideas that we're tearing down? What are the, what are the kind of logics in place that'll rebuild the CNN sign, after a fake protester destroys it for insurance claims? It's just like, so it's like, it's that like Ouroboros of all these different signals and signs. And so I'm thinking about like how bodily formlessness, like, just, the way that holding Black bodies after these viral shootings and viral murders happen is so important. Like, talking to my family, talking to my sisters, like understanding the body as like not the end, for whatever, just understanding that the body is just not the end. And but also that the image of death is in a place in our culture of entertainment. And that being like a place that where the form of grief or something just becomes so fluid, right? Because it's like the spectacle, the grief, so it's just the history of Emmett Till and the idea of like form, disrupted form, perfect form, formlessness, and like the Black body and how porous in image we are and how celebrated that porousness is, has been something that's like very like just almost toxically on my mind, that formlessness. Like, I want to think about a full Black body, right? I want to speculate about a Black body that's not surrounded by doubt of its sanity, its criminality, of its, even religiosity, of its origin, and I can't, so then I don't know. So I'm thinking about that formlessness a lot in terms of like how to structure anti-Black, or how to structure pushback against a lot of anti-Blackness that's been normalized already. And then mind-wise, like the formlessness of like a kind of hive mind, or thinking about like resistance, colonial resistance, almost as like birds, or like, I think the language of Anonymous, like we are legion, being as water, being as birds, and that kind of being like protest language, this sort of call and response, that's an inherent value. You know, the value that's in the field, even if there's not a shared language, produces that call and response, that call out, that call in. And so, and I think of that as like formless resistance. You know, it's like we don't need a leader if that logic produces the call in motion, you know, like, and the trappings of Messiah complexes for so many different colonial and like colonial descendants, you know, descendants of slavery. I feel like that the image of the Messiah is the thing that, you know, is a kind of form that we can do away with, you know? And so I'm thinking about pedagogy and hive minding and like kind of like decentralized leadership in terms of the press a lot. And then, yeah, I think we like just energy wise, like logics of repair and how like formless, like how logic is formless outside of action.
This gets actually to a question that's come through from the audience that's pertinent here, which is so much of language is so violent, right? This question comes from Chloe. Chloe is thinking about the synonyms for photography, shooting, capturing, etc. So how do we move to a space of changing language? What are some of the imaginaries or ways that you all are thinking about new language? And I think for me, this really ties into this idea of formlessness, right? What are we imagining? Takes the place of the old.
Let's drop one bomb, but TikTok. I've been screaming, literally, about TikTok and how a dialogic is just so inherent. Like it's all these disparate, misconnected, broken semiotic forms that like are enlivened by Black dance and Black song and Black gesture, but then like are used for all these, and I think not necessarily, it's like blackface is not necessarily just the thing, right? It's like the gesture and how the gesture gets like produces a space of editorial, of critique, you know, like Jess was saying, like this becomes a site of intervention, a site of critique, and that's been really exciting. And I feel like it's kind of made me think that it doesn't matter what, you know, or not, that doesn't matter. Basically just like giving people the option of dialogic images would produce so much new language. You know, like I feel like the thing that it's just about freeing up certain archives so that there isn't just the one image of the Black Panthers and the Yellow Peril, you know, from Devin Aoki. There's like a plethora of images of different coalition building support, you know, like that then Black TikTokers can take and do whatever, or like TikTok can take and do whatever on a global scale. Like that's my hopeful version of TikTok. It's also crazy, but I just dropping TikTok in there.
My 13-year-old niece would love to hear that. She stays on the TikTok. Jess, Vivian, I'd love to also hear from you, sort of where are you thinking in terms of this new language creation, how we shift the language that we use?
Yeah, I mean, I still believe in art. I don't know if that's like, you know, a thing still, but I do believe in art and the visual language and the possibilities that can open up, and sound, you know, and like I was saying, performance, all these, you know, I just always think in terms of, you know, this idea of the Anthropocene being like, you know, what is documented and what is like compacted, and just think like how will like bird songs be compacted in that. You know, I don't know, you know, what I can do to change, you know, that what we can do to change language, but just I think opening up possibilities of different forms of communication.
Yeah.
I'm so glad that you brought up bird songs, because that has been on repeat for me. So not only like the activity of birds, which has reached a symphony that I've never heard in LA before, but also I've been putting bird sounds on just like in my meditative space. So yes to bird sounds. Jess, it looks like you wanted to add something there.
Yeah. I was just gonna say, I've been thinking about this question of form in relation to dance and choreography. So the really great thing about working in a partnership is that you're building a thing with another person, but you're also two people kind of building other things. And so one of the ways in which I think my own practice as a writer has been opened up through partnership with Taylor is by witnessing the partnership and kind of intellectual pairings that she has formed with a choreographer and dancer by the name of Jennifer Harge. And through that scholarship and through that like intellectual romance, friendship, kinship, right, the idea of the score keeps coming back up. And I think for me, in witnessing that and watching that, what it prompts is how can writing be thought as something that can live alongside Black dance, and how can Black dance give us, through an embodied experience, a new vocabulary, right? So I'm thinking about this in relationship very much to the way choreography and dance as a form, as taken up by Black choreographers, might literally move writing into a new place. And could the score as a kind of concept, as a way of arranging text on a page, be a place where the work that I know I do personally, but also the work that ARTS.BLACK is doing, could that be a shift for us, right? And so, I don't know, that for me is also something that brings me a lot of joy, to think about like what it means to be in the body, like sweating, stepping, moving, touching, right? And what that means for the work that we do as writers.
Y'all are so on it. I was about to ask the question from Camila, which is, what role does pleasure and joy play in your publication projects? And Jess, you preempted it with your beauty right there. Candice, Vivian, would you like to talk a little bit about where pleasure and joy is playing out for you in the work right now?
Sure, I can do that quickly. I just talked to Manuel Arturo, who's a really great scholar who's going to work with Cassandra for the pedagogy. But yeah, I think right now it's just sort of making connections, you know, like putting the book down for a moment, because it's not discourse moment, has been really like pleasurable, actually, like figuring out kind of like where, you know, things connect across disparate forms of media and in different communities and in different conversation, or, you know, different platforms. I just got on Twitter for the first time ever. I just got TikTok. So I'm like, you know, I'm just kind of excited to see what kind of like where theory gets attached to reality, I guess, where like the theory that I've kind of been stewing in for 4 years is going to be attached to reality, and especially like kind of movements online, and yeah, and like new archives or emerging archives or recovered archives is super fascinating stuff right now. And just having fun with how to present it, you know, like teaching as a means of presenting all this kind of stored discourse, and having fun with like the ways that I'm connecting ideas has been really pleasurable.
Vivian, where is play coming forward in the publishing practice for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think all the time. You know, I think just having deep one-on-one conversations with artists and being able to sit with their work, you know, even though I feel I'm working urgently and anxiously, I'm, you know, still giving artists a lot of time to, you know, in terms of like processing their work and talking through it with them. And so, you know, in order, you know, we're making something together, and that is always a very pleasurable thing.
We have another question from the audience. I'll just read it aloud. I teach high school students, 98% of whom are Black and live in low-income communities in Brooklyn. I'm proposing a class focused on coming-of-age narratives of the African diaspora. So far, I'm using film and art, but how can I bring in more archival work to younger students? So I think there's, you know, whether you have a specific answer for this person, I think this question of how do we give youth access to the archives is one that we can definitely build on. But any more specific recommendations are welcome. Jess, you want to kick things off?
Sure. Yeah, that's a really important question. And I don't want to assume, but I guess my first response is kind of what archive, right? Like archives exists in a multitudinous way. And so if this is a question of kind of capital B broad, like Black diasporic archives of cultural production, part of my response would certainly be to kind of tend to film and visual art. I'm also thinking about listening, like what might it mean to kind of ask young people what is preoccupying them right now, and if there are ways to connect, for example, with local institutions on the ground. So my first kind of organizational home with 651 Arts in Brooklyn, which is a lovely home dedicated to performing arts of the African diaspora. And so 651 literally has an archive of Black performance across the diaspora for the past 30 years, both printed in a publication that they used to print, as well as video records. And so that is something, that's where my mind is going. Like are there local organizations on the ground that might be able to help steward this type of knowledge sharing alongside you? And I would be happy to think through other places and send them to Cameron or Alexandra so that they could be passed along. But I think that there are really great places for collaboration and partnership that are also coming with their own libraries. And because they aren't necessarily the Guggenheims or the Mets or the Brooklyn Museums, for example, that they are not received, you know, like I'm also thinking about a place like the Weeksville Heritage Center, which is such an important place and site of Black cultural production and thought. And so I think that that's where my suggestion would start. Like, are there ways to collaborate with folks who are there in these smaller institutional settings and bring them into the classroom with you, or bring your classroom to them?
Thank you, Jess. I also just want to shout out our beautiful audience at home. Someone actually offered up a personal contact to share with the person who asked that question. So y'all are just amazing. Your questions are amazing. Your generosity is amazing. So thank you. I'm going to go to another question from our beautiful audience. In the process of producing and publishing, I can imagine you become continually changed, reshaped, affected by the material and its in development. So I'm wondering what strategies and space you each create for inserting your own subjective context, personal narratives, your thoughts on self-reflexivity, and the publishing experience. So yeah, where do you all insert yourselves personally? I think we touched on that a little bit, but I'd be really curious how you really create and carve out that space to do that work.
Yeah, so for me, I try to get to know the artist's work as much as possible, to the extent where I feel like I could maybe predict the decisions that they would make. But ultimately, it always comes down to seeking permission. So in terms of, and building trust. So I think, you know, I've been very fortunate to be, you know, I recognize the trust that is given when, you know, you're asking someone to represent your work. And so I'm never making a decision. If I have like a, you know, a personal idea, it's always about asking permission for me.
Candice, did you have anything that you wanted to add there about creating that space for you to insert yourself? I know you talked a little bit about how deeply embedded yourself is in the practice already, but I'm wondering, you know, what you create for yourself to preserve self, or to build some sort of space that is protective around that also.
Oh, wow. I guess I'm figuring that out right now, with sort of like figuring out how to bring people in. Sorry, there's tons of helicopters. Just trying to figure out how to bring people in to the work that I've been doing so far. You know, like I feel like I had a show at Printed Matter in January, and I was almost like sort of feeling like this is a moment to just like the press was done, you know, but like as an edition making personal artist thing, that it's like, okay, I got to go make friends or something, you know, like take a break, take a nap. But now I think, yeah, it's just been, bringing people in, like, and decentralizing my own voice, you know, like talking to friends from other presses who would do, you know, things like translation, imprints. We're thinking about, you know, how to make educational material available to minors, especially. We want to start like a children's kind of like Elsewhere Editions is a press I really like as well. They've started a children's imprint and a children's translation imprint. So thinking about stuff like that, like translation, again, is like a way of kind of decentralizing one voice or decentralizing one practice or even one word's definition or meaning, and spreading it across, like kind of spreading it across with protective strategy in mind, you know? So yeah, I guess I kind of started this monster, and it's just been like getting friends and people who are doing similar stuff like together, to decentralize what the soul kind of, yeah, for that to decentralize myself is like a goal, I guess.
No, that brings us actually to, I'll end on this last question from the audience, on the topic of bringing people in, which is, what advice would you give a writer who wants to release work but has no clue where to start and no idea if the work is even good enough to put out? Do you have any advice to that writer who's looking to publish, that artist who's looking to create something?
Self-publish.
Yes, that's what I echo that. Do it yourself.
Jess, anything else?
Yeah, I mean, self-publishing is always great. I'm also wondering if where they are in a hyper-local context, if there can be a community of people that they trust, regardless of if those people identify as writers or artists. But if there can be a way to kind of like come to this work in a communal context, like, are there people who you trust to read what you're writing? Are there folks who you trust to kind of be the tough editor? I think sometimes how we understand someone's gifts or expertise is very much or maybe overly tied to title. And I just think that perhaps there are ways in which some of the folks around us might be, even if they aren't necessarily doing the thing that we want to do, might also be best poised to be the most honest about our work. So yeah, I'm thinking a lot about like that a community of readers and editors. I also am someone who I always like reading and talking with new writers, so I'm happy to also offer myself up as someone who could be a part of that. But yeah, I mean, personally, I know that I have a circle of friends, whether they identify as writers or not, who are always going to be honest with me about the work that I'm trying to make. And so that has been really helpful and generative for my own practice. So I would offer that up as a suggestion too, in addition to self-publishing.
Thank you. I think coming back to that idea of the community around us as the folks that we are well positioned to work with and to serve one another is a really nice place to end. I apologize for the folks who did not get your questions answered. We had so many questions for our brilliant panelists, but thank you guys so much for your time tonight and for sharing your insights. I love this conversation. Alexandra, did you want to close us out?
I will. Kudos to you all. This was an incredible conversation. I rarely get to enjoy the conversation because I'm always doing double duty. So it's lovely when I get to enjoy. And I hope that the audience enjoyed as much as I did. We'll be making this public to you all for future viewage. Likely on YouTube, so follow us on social media to get more on that. And we have a few more programs coming up this month, so we hope that you'll join us. And also please connect with each of the panelists on their social media followings and get their publications. Support Black women, support Black publications. And yeah, that's it. Thank you all for joining us. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.